Hi everyone. This video is going to be part film review and part analysis of some of the issues around that film review, most notably conspiracy theories on the JFK assassination. Now, obviously, there is an avalanche of information out there. It's one of the most discussed events, really, of the 20th century. We've just had the 60th anniversary, and the questions haven't gone away, and they probably never will. You know, there's been four American presidents assassinated. Um, the Garfield and McKinley assassinations have kind of faded into time. Um, I'm sure they were big news at the time, but in the case of Garfield, he survived after the shooting for quite a while, a few months. Um, and actually, the metal detector was invented in the hope of finding the bullet there. In the case of McKinley, he'd already served a full term. In the case of Lincoln, that has a few conspiracy theories, such as a wider Confederate conspiracy, and that's still quite widely spoken about. But that was coming at the end of an incredibly costly civil war. Then we come to Kennedy. I think of the four, that remains by far the most discussed, the most analysed, the most controversial. Kennedy, of course, represented a new era. He represented youthful vitality, optimism, and then, of course, he was gunned down in Dealey Plaza, a place that will forever be associated with that. If I'm ever in Dallas, don't go to plan to go anytime soon, but if I am ever in that city, I will visit the Sixth Floor Museum. I think that's very important. And honestly, like a lot of people, I'm fascinated by this case. Also, the RFK assassination, but that's for another video. 60 years now. The event happened on my mother's 10th birthday, exactly the 22nd of November 1963. So the film I'm going to be discussing here is Oliver Stone's JFK. It's a film I know very well. It's a film I've seen many times. It's going to be part film review and part critique of what Stone is putting forward, and they're not exactly the same thing because purely as a film, I'm talking cinematically here. I think it's excellent. I think it's a great movie. I think it's very engaging. I think the acting is some of the best I have ever seen on screen. No exaggeration. I mean, it's a very stellar cast. There is Kevin Costner in the lead role as New Orleans District Attorney Jim Garrison. Tommy Lee Jones plays the businessman Clay Shaw, and there's other major supporting cast members like Joe Pesci, um, and many others. Donald Sutherland. Um, Purely cinematically, I'll say this: Oliver Stone knows how to engage an audience. There's Alexander. There is Nixon, released in 1995, has similar overtones, though not quite as controversial as this. W, released in, I think that was about 2009, about the presidency of George W. Bush. And that's Stone's go-to. In fact, and then Platoon, of course, was his one of his debuts. I believe he had been a Vietnam veteran, and that was what he became known for making these historically gripping films. Natural Born Killers, deeply controversial movie, 1994. Um, Ironically, probably the least controversial Stone film is World Trade Center, despite also being like the JFK thing about a very famous event which is drenched in conspiracy theories. Curiously enough, that is one that Stone kind of played straight. It was just a straightforward, you know, story, human interest story about two Port Authority workers who were trapped in the rubble of the World Trade Center. A very powerful movie, but it was unusual for Stone because it was actually not that political. Very different from JFK in that sense. So that brings me to JFK. Cinematically, like I say, it's very impressive. It's long, it's 3 hours, but to me, it never feels slow. The pace is good. You know, there's plenty of drama, action. It never feels slow, despite having a running length of 3 hours. And basically, summed up, it is about the sort of solo crusade of the New Orleans District Attorney, Jim Garrison, to reopen the case, aside from the official Warren Commission findings of 1964. And he does this to the point of doggedness, to the point of straining his marriage. His wife's played by Sissy Spacek. But basically, it ends up in a courtroom drama scene, and he brings about the only person ever brought to trial for the JFK assassination, a businessman by the name of Clay Shaw, who was acquitted. But basically, Stone presents Garrison as a principled and courageous fighter for truth. A character who wants his children to grow up in an America that is doesn't hide its the secrets of power from the people, and that is very much the angle that Stone is taking. So Kevin Costner, great performance. He definitely portrays Garrison as a stubborn man, but principled man. Um, and yeah, that is clearly the angle that is being taken. Now, others have that knew the real Jim Garrison, and he makes a cameo appearance at the end very briefly as Earl Warren. But basically, there's others who say that Jim Garrison was a charlatan. He used manipulative tactics, and his prosecution of Clay Shaw amounted to a miscarriage of justice. Although Shaw was acquitted, um, they argue actually the man was totally innocent, and Garrison had an obsession. He was also trying to further his own reputation. Who knows? Who knows? Garrison, like many involved in the events, has now passed away himself. But the film had such an influence that it actually made political changes insofar as pressuring Congress to allow many archives to reopen. I think it was called the JFK Disclosure Act, if I've got that right. Officially, they weren't going to be released until the year 2038, which is actually mentioned in the film, i.e., 75 years after the event. But as it turned out, in 1992, most of the archives were released. There are still a few thousand, 70,000 or so have been released, but there are still a few thousand that haven't been. Um, but let me get into the film itself, what it's actually arguing. So basically, Garrison starts to pick out shady figures in his jurisdiction, and he starts to make all these links, and he brings them in for questioning. And initially, he isn't pursuing this. I should say the opening scene is very engaging. It sort of starts with General Eisenhower's farewell address to the nation. It gets into a little synopsis of Kennedy's presidency. But this is juxtaposed with this kind of a military drumming beat, and it shows the motorcade going down Dealey Plaza. It's very intense, very well done. Um, and it sort of shows these little things in the background which show this isn't going to be a straightforward historical account. It shows a man having a stroke. It shows posters saying treason on it, JFK treason. And then from then out, this is not going to be a normal film. Jack Lemmon plays a character who notices strange behavior by his boss. He's a local, I believe he's a local detective, but he notices strange behavior of his boss who kind of assaults him and says, "You didn't see a goddamn thing," and referring to things he'd been seen going on in the office. But there is a lot of layers to this film, and if you watch it for the first time, it can be pretty complex. It does take probably a couple of viewings to get all the sort of angles that Stone is pushing. And I do say that Stone is pushing because this is very much, I think, an auteur project. Um, it focuses on several things. It focuses on Garrison's, dogged pursuit of the truth, like I say, to the strain of his marriage. It focuses on Lee Harvey Oswald, played by Gary Oldman. Again, great performance. And it shows basically the stereotype of what Oswald was, a loner, a mysterious young man who was kind of bitter with the world. He'd spent time in Russia. He had a strained marriage. It goes through all of that, but it taps into the fact that there was a conspiracy, or the proposition that there was a conspiracy, and it alleges that there was all these connections that Oswald had with Clay Shaw, with David Ferry, and the whole gay under scene in the New Orleans social circuit. Um, and There's mafia aspects there, although that's not an overt part of the story. Um, at one point, there's even propositions that LBJ was behind it. Surprise, surprise. Everything is thrown in there basically. Um, there's a particularly notable scene where Donald Sutherland plays a character called Mr. X. Now, this person was based, and actually, I've got a Guardian article in front of me, and I should really break that down a bit. But this character, Mr. X, was based on a real person, a retired Air Force officer by the name of Prouty. Now, I'm just going to go through the article here on The Guardian because it really critiques Stone's film. This is by Alex von Tunselman and it was published in 2011, so 20 years after the Stone film. Oliver Stone's fine fictional account of John F. Kennedy's assassination dodges the truth like a magic bullet. Um, and of course, I'm saying a paywall. Irritating. Anyway, I'll try and recall what I read there. If you open up this link, you should be able to view it the first time. But that's the thing, the lonely that you look at once and then there's a paywall. The Guardian does that. They let you look at the article once. But anyway, in the article, there's a number of flaws about Stone's film. This character, Mr. X, played by Donald Sutherland, basically he meets Garrison in Washington, D.C., and it's about a 15-minute sequence, 10, 15-minute sequence, and he goes through this whole question of you're talking about who killed JFK. The real question is why. That's where you need to start. And he gets into a whole analysis of Kennedy wanting to pull troops out of Vietnam, and this basically being a green light, the assassination being a green light for Johnson to escalate the war. It's quite a spooky sequence the way it's done. There's a bit where whoever's playing LBJ says, "I'll give you your damn war," and Donald Sutherland's character in that document, the Vietnam War. It's all very sinister music, and Stone's a genius with this stuff. He knows how to engage the audience. The problem is that whole sequence is based on a character whose credibility was later seriously called into question by the investigative journalist Edward Epstein. So already there you have a problem. In the film, Donald Sutherland's character is portrayed as smart, trustworthy, and motivated by wanting to tell the truth. And he's a convincing character. And Jim Garrison is taken in by him. But like I say, in reality, his credibility came under serious question. The character of David Ferry, played by Joe Pesci, in the film, he is very much involved in the conspiracy. He's basically a loudmouth who is in this kind of social scene with Clay Shaw, and they're a right wing group who want to take Kennedy out. Um, Now, the real David Ferry always pleaded his innocence. He was never charged with anything. And had he actually lived, I believe he died in a road accident. The film implies he was murdered in mysterious circumstances. I think he died in a road accident, if I've got that right. But basically, that's a character assassination. It basically portrays him as this loose cannon, this hot-tempered individual who's very, very much involved in the conspiracy. Um, and what the article by Alex von Tunselman argues is if Ferry were still alive, he would actually have grounds to sue Oliver Stone for libel. Such was the distortion of reality. Then there's another very practical point. There's an important courtroom scene in the finale of JFK during the trial of Clay Shaw. And in this scene, basically, it shows them showing the magic bullet theory. And Garrison has two of his assistants sort of sat out as if they were Kennedy and Connolly. The problem is in the movie, it depicts them as being directly, parallel to one another, like Connolly directly in front of Kennedy. Now, I'm watching a documentary by the BBC's Gavin Isler. It was recorded in 2004 and it directly debunks this scene. Why? Because in reality, in the motorcade, the way the limo was designed, Connolly was actually slightly in from Kennedy and slightly lower down. In that sense, the trajectory of the bullet from the Texas School Book Depository is in fact direct. So there's no mystery about it. It's a direct bullet that would hit Kennedy and Connolly at the same time. And actually, if you look at the Zapruder film, you see both men reacting at the same time. Now, I'm not going to say in this video I'm absolutely going with that as the truth. It is true that various witnesses report different things about how many shots were fired, and that will probably never be resolved. Different people said different things. I watched an article last night on, not an article, a video on a local Dallas news network, and the anchorman thought he heard a certain number of shots. The witnesses there thought they heard a different number. So, in a dramatic event, people get there's lots of panic and people get different perceptions of what they think they've heard. That happens. But that point's important because in the Stone film, it's basically implying, well, the magic bullet theory is nonsense because how can a bullet have that sort of trajectory and it's going all sorts of angles? Well, if the president and Governor Connolly were in that position, it would be an absurd trajectory, except they weren't in that position. They were in a position that allowed for that trajectory. It's an important point, and it's one that Stone ignores. Anyway, I'm going to wrap this up quite soon, but my concern about this movie is my concerns about a character like Oliver Stone more broadly. He's made a name for himself for calling for truth to power, right? But I'll admit a prejudice against Oliver Stone. I didn't used to feel this way, but it's kind of been in recent years. He's very clearly become a bit unhinged, and his his pandering to Putinism is to me absolutely disgraceful. Um, you know, when he done that documentary where he was interviewing Putin, it may as well have been a teenager at a rock concert. It's quite obvious that Stone was absolutely dewy-eyed for the Russian dictator. Um, and the big problem I have with someone like Oliver Stone is he talks about holding truth to power, right? And that's his whole go-to. That's his whole pitch. But when you actually break down what he proposes and when you actually break down these things, A, his pandering to Putin is contemptible. It really is. I mean, what sort of, if you look at the assertion of JFK, it's all about, the totalitarian Lyndon Johnson government held the truth from the American people in order to justify the Vietnam War. But look at what's happening in Russia today. Any Russian who steps out of line is immediately thrown in prison for years. So, in my view, someone like Oliver Stone, who has a lot of power, he's a powerful figure in Hollywood. He has millions to throw at his movies. Um, a lot more people are going to see a movie like that than the documentary I'm watching right now. Um, but it does not make it doesn't not make a film a documentary. And if you just look at the comments on anything to do with this movie, people act as if it is a documentary. It's not. It's a powerful film. It's a well executed film, but in terms of accuracy, it's got some very serious flaws. And people just need to be objective about that. Oliver Stone has always been motivated by, I think increasingly so, by a worldview that is the wicked American government is responsible for all the world's problems. That's basically Oliver Stone's worldview. And, it is what it is. He is basically the Hollywood equivalent of you name you name it. There's any number of politicians right now, some of them vying for the presidency, that are pandering disgracefully to Putin. Some people might think I beat my drum a bit on this, but this is a major, major issue in the world today in terms of totalitarianism. Putin's Russia and Xi Jinping's China, particularly. There's other examples, but for someone who's made a career out of supposedly telling the truth and holding truth to power, um, this is such a contradictory position to then serve as basically a propagandist for Putin. I would not at all be surprised if the next Oliver Stone film is about how the Ukrainians are actually Nazis and the invasion was justified. That's the line that Oliver Stone is going down, and I think it's contemptible. Um, I would say it's actually an abuse of power on his part. But the thing is, a lot of people will believe this stuff, and that's really unfortunate. Now, I'm very quickly going to just show another film, also about the same event. Parkland, made in 2013. It's nowhere near as well known as JFK, but in my opinion, it's also a very powerful movie. It's different because it's more of a straight account of just the events, and specifically Kennedy being treated at Parkland Memorial Hospital, um, and also the story of Robert Oswald, Lee Harvey Oswald's brother. But this specifically avoids conspiracy theories, and it focuses a lot on Abraham Zapruder, the man who made that famous video, and how, played by Paul Gin, if I'm getting that actor's name right, very good actor. Where are we here? Bear with me. Yeah, Paul Giamatti, I think is the guy's name. Very good character actor. Yeah, Paul Giamatti. He plays Abraham Zapruder. Billy Bob Thornton's in this. Zac Efron. But basically, it's focusing on the events at the hospital. Now, this didn't get as much attention as JFK, much smaller budget, but it's done in a way that isn't sensationalist. It's done in a way that's just looking at the human drama of the event, and also the situation that Robert Oswald was in. He always believed his brother acted alone. Um, I strongly recommend watching this movie as well. If you watch JFK, watch this. JFK is a powerful movie, but I would say this is probably more accurate. Um, what else can I say? This film, incidentally, is also the first time director, Peter Anderson, who also happened to be an experienced journalist, unlike Oliver Stone. You know, this was someone who had reported from Kosovo, I believe, I think Rwanda as well, and several other wars. He was an experienced journalist and he went to film. And frankly, I find him more credible than Oliver Stone, given Oliver Stone's reputation now and given what I believe is his worldview and his agenda. I think Oliver Stone is smart enough to know how to keep audiences engaged. I think as a filmmaker, he makes engaging, powerful films, but he unquestionably, pushes an agenda that is very flawed. And actually, the Guardian review says entertainment grade B, history grade fail. I probably concur with that. Um, Finally, I personally believe there are definitely some things that were not really answered about that day and probably never will be sufficiently. I know there are some like Greg Posner who go to the other side of things and say it was definitely Oswald alone, there was no conspiracy. Um, and Robert Oswald, his own brother, believed he acted alone. It may well be that there were others who wanted Kennedy dead, but in the end it was Oswald acting alone. He got there first. Um, there is absolutely, like I say, an avalanche of information on this. I've studied the subject quite extensively, and I don't know. I don't know what the truth is. I think it is quite possible that there were others involved, but bear in mind, Lee Harvey Oswald was a murderer. He unquestionably killed Officer Tippett that day, so this was a man who was capable of murder. He fled from the Texas movie theater. He tried to. Now, an innocent person does not flee, so that's not evidence that he acted alone, but the idea that he was a totally innocent bystander, I think that's really baseless because no one disputes that he killed Officer Tippett. So if he's capable of killing a police officer, why not elevate that? He had an obsession with a right-wing general, General Walker, that he had apparently tried to kill. Um, so I think that it's one of those things though. As I'm reading, I've just started reading Stephen King's 11/22/63, and it starts off by saying a quote from Norman Mailer. The book's not handy, but basically, in fact, if I just get it, it is worth reading out. No, it's next door. I'll leave it. But anyway, Norman Mailer makes a point that people do not want to accept that, like Caesar killed with all the power surrounding him. Kennedy was killed with his legions, with his limousine, with his security, and he still died. And no one wants to believe that such a nobody, inverted commas, killed a giant. Actually, the thing about Oswald being a complete loner isn't entirely true. He was married. I mean, it was a difficult marriage, but he was married. He was not completely alone, and the Oswalds were living with another family at the time. So it's not quite accurate that he was completely a loner. Um, that part. So it's more that he was a troubled young man who had clearly, tried to make a name for himself. He tried to defect to the Soviet Union unsuccessfully. So I think it's obvious that he was angry with the world and he wanted to prove something. Anyway, let me know your thoughts on Oliver Stone's JFK. I have no doubt this will attract a few comments. I hope it does. I hope it does. But I will not lie. I feel that Oliver Stone pushes an agenda, and it is not an objective agenda. Um, I think Oliver Stone's worldview has been very much molded by an ideology that is blame America first and only. And also, I think in Hollywood today, Adam McKay is trying to make himself the new Oliver Stone. If you're familiar with McKay, he'd done the villain Vice about Dick Cheney, and that film had pretty much everything except Darth Vader music. Had some strong points, but I think it was kind of like Oliver Stone light. Um, and also, Adam McKay funds Just Stop Oil, or he has funded it, so you can imagine what I think of that. Let me know your thoughts. Oliver Stone's JFK.